I know, it's not the Spirit Science video. Anyway, all of you have seen the title of this video, and I gotta tell you, this topic has been driving me nuts. For reasons it really shouldn't be driving anyone nuts. In August of 2024, a series of news articles really, was released that suggested that the Shroud of Turin genuinely dated to the 1st century AD. Now, if you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, don't worry, we'll go over it. But essentially, the whole ordeal has been one giant case of science miscommunication and a thought exercise in the spread of misinformation. So, what I'm going to do in this video, and this is as the introduction, I will be going over every single scientific claim that I could possibly find about the Shroud of Turin, and we'll be going over it bit by bit. But first, since this is a science video, we need to start by talking about the reasons why we're doing this, potential biases, and then our methodologies. Starting with the reason why I'm doing this. I want to say it's gotten oddly personal because no matter where I turn, people keep talking to me about the supposed legitimacy of this object. I'll get to that in the next section with biases. But, you know, a lot of these people who are talking to me, and, you know, for anyone who watches this, I plan on directly sending this to like 20 plus people. And I'm sure those people who I've sent it to are sitting there thinking to themselves, is he talking about me? I kind of am, but don't worry, you're not alone, and it's not personal. But the reasons why I'm doing that is because of these people, that I care about them, I want them to know the truth, and we have to understand certain fundamental realities about the Shroud if we're going to talk about this in a serious manner. Ergo, what I'm seeing is a number of people are suggesting that the Shroud is legitimate based off some sort of scientific finding. Now, if this were a faith conviction, I wouldn't be making this video. The problem with that is that when you analyze the Shroud of Turin from all angles with a high knowledge on science, it becomes self-evident that this modern claim is A, dubious, and B, really not all that scientific. And that the Shroud of Turin's authenticity is not verifiable. Well, no. And that the Shroud from a scientific perspective is not as verifiable as people think. Now, does that mean that it's a fake? We'll get to that. What that does mean is that if you genuinely believe the Shroud to be legitimate based off scientific means and not spiritual means, then the full brunt width of the scientific data ought to be considered. And that's really what this video is intended to do. Give non-believers all the information and believers all the information. So that way you can walk away with a more refined scientific understanding of the Shroud of Turin. I got what I believe to be about halfway through this video, only to realize that I have forgot to even give an introduction as to who I am and why I'm qualified to be talking about this. Hi, I'm Josh. I'm an interdisciplinary earth scientist. Typically, I go by geologist or interdisciplinary geologist because that people understand what that is, and they don't really understand the nuanced difference between earth scientist and geologist. But here, I think it really matters that I talk about what I truly am. I have a bachelor's in science, in earth science, with a focus in geology, a minor's in physics, and a minor's in astronomy. What this means is that I'm very much familiar with other things outside of just rocks. I have studied significantly more than just rocks. I'm familiar with dating methods, I'm familiar with biology, I'm familiar with evolution, I'm familiar with star patterns, star ages, you know, all that stuff. I can take you and your kids stargazing one day if you want. The gist of it is that, generally speaking, when it comes to pretty much all the topics surrounding the Shroud, I am more than capable of commenting on it. Now, does that make me by any means any expert on the Shroud? No. But what it does mean is that, unlike most people who are incapable of even assessing these claims, I can very much take a look at all of them, and if I don't know something, I can easily learn about it. If you don't want to trust me off the grounds that I'm not a direct expert on the Shroud itself, fair enough. Click away on this video and go watch, I don't know, whatever it is you people watch in your free time. With that, let's get into our biases. It may shock some people who have talked to me about this privately, but I don't really care about the Shroud of Turin. I really don't. I've had a number of people state to my face that I have a strong belief against the Shroud, and I'll get into that later in the video. I want to save that for my conclusions when I talk about cognitive bias. But the reality of it is that this could be real and it could be fake, and it wouldn't really change anything. I will say this. People who know me really ought to know that my opposition to it really sticks out, because as a believer and a scientist, it would be more convenient if it were real. So the very fact that I'm saying it's not real shows the very antithesis of bias. With that being said, I will admit bias in the sense that because I am fueled by a need to correct all the people I have now had this conversation with in person, there may be some level of wanting to debunk it in order to facilitate the outcome that I've been trying to get everyone to lean on to begin with. Take that bias with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, keep it in mind. Next, we're going to move on to methods. Now, obviously, I don't have the physical Shroud on me to sit down and test it. So our methodology is simply going to be going over every single claim and verifying it on a scientific level, be it whether or not it's got data that I can look at, or if it's just a complete and raw claim. For each and every fact we go over, there will be approximately 5 different categories that we are going to put every single claim into. We're going to be putting them into either factual, contested, leaning factual, contested, contested leaning false, and false. I've left the contested category as wide open as I possibly can so as to filter out any and all possible biases that I may or may not have, that may or may not be confirmable, yada, yada, yada. I still anticipate people claiming I didn't analyze the Shroud fairly. Whatever. And finally, let's go over some rhetoric. Let's go over some basic philosophy. This was originally going to be attached to methods, but I'm making it its own category now. I know I said I was going to do 3, but whatever. For starters, I think it should be self-evident that I do not have to disprove something that is unproven. The burden of proof is always on the claimant, not the skeptic. What that means is if there is a claim regarding the shroud that is subsequently unproven, then it will immediately go into the contested leaning false category where it will likely stay there. Now, that might strike people as being biased, but I will once again remind you, I do not have to disprove things that are not proven. And I will still engage honestly with the things that are not proven, but that I cannot in good conscience pretend that they are at all remotely factual when they are, by definition, unproven. I'm making this clear now because as we go along with all these supposed facts surrounding the shroud, it'll become increasingly clear that most of these are not even established facts about the shroud. Additionally, I have with me the lunch bag of miracles and the tinfoil of truth. What are these two tools going to be used for, you might ask? Well, simple. Every single time a truth claim of the shroud requires essentially a miracle, and by miracle I either mean something supernaturally occurrent and or something so statistically unlikely that it would have to be a miracle, I'm going to put a little tinfoil ball from the tinfoil of truth into the sandwich bag of miracles. And by the end of it, I hope everyone's going to be able to see just how much supernaturalism you are going to need to invoke in order for this to be remotely plausible. Now, I understand that if you've even bothered to watch this far, if you're a believer, you may have said to yourself, well, Josh has already tipped his hand. He doesn't believe in the shroud. And I think that's fair. Just understand that I am merely going over the scientific claims and analyzing them from a scientific perspective. It's not on me to take your faith away from you. All I am merely saying is that with the influx of people who now believe it to be legitimate based off this scientific evidence, there are a couple things that you ought to know about the shroud, and that the various claims being made by people in order to synergize with this newfound authenticity are kind of not telling the truth. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start by talking about things that are non-controversial about the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a piece of cloth hosted in Turin, Italy. It measures approximately 4.4 meters by 1.1 meters, and it depicts a man who has supposedly been crucified. That's about it. That's all that can really be said about the shroud that's non-controversial. So the Shroud of Turin has no established history past the year 1353, which is a humongous red flag right off the bat. No established provenience is going to be a real problem, but we're not even in the debunking mode. I just want to make it clear here that that's a problem. Where it was under the ownership of a feudal lord named Geoffrey de Charny. Charny died in 1356, and around 1355, Robert de Ciliac began exhibiting it at churches. One thing to note around this time period is that Nicole Oresme, the Bishop of Liswix, denounced the shroud as a forgery, believing it to be the work of clergymen for the purpose of making money. By 1390, the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre de Arx, had jurisdiction over the Church of Liry and had written a lengthy memorandum to Pope Clement VII, declaring that the shroud was a forgery and that the previous Bishop of Troyes, Henry de Pointers, had actually identified the artist who made it. At some point, the shroud ended up in the possession of Marguerite de Charny, the granddaughter of the knight who had originally owned it, and she took it out on traveling exhibitions and basically refused to give it up. Fun fact, she was subsequently excommunicated. It then ended up in the possession of the House of Savoy, where it was subsequently passed down until it was bought to Turin, where it lies to this day. One of the important things between then and now is that in 1997, on April the 11th, a fire caused from unknown circumstances subsequently damaged a piece of the shroud, and that it remains displayed in the cathedral at Turin to this day. I hate to skip over a lot of its nuanced history, but I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist. I just went over some of the more relevant bits for this video. And with that being said, let's get right into it. We're going to start with, why are we starting with blood? Because I'm hemophobic, and I don't want to talk about blood any more than I have to talk about blood. So, from the top, there is blood on the Shroud of Turin. I am going to go ahead and actually say that this is contested, leaning true. There are multiple papers that are definitely saying that there is blood on the shroud, but there is some contention in that the material that we have found on the shroud is not actually blood. It is material that we find in blood, but we can also find it in other things like red ochre paint. The blood tests in particular claimed to have found heme and porphyrins. How that blood got there based off its construction, no one really knows. Of course, believers are going to claim that it's the blood of Christ. The stains contain human blood proteins, aka albumin, immunoglobulins. There is no proof of this, so that's contested, leaning false. The blood type is type AB. This is completely unproven. The AB typing was reported back in the 1980s, but ABO on serology and ancient contaminated materials is notably unreliable, very much prone to false reports. Modern views recommend treating the shroud's type as unknown, pending DNA-based typing. Also, ancient remains often skew spuriously towards AB, so the idea that type AB blood was found on the shroud is just nonsense. A bit of a side tangent here. I have also seen some pro-shroud people claim that type AB blood is Semitic blood. It's not. There's nothing special about type AB blood that makes it specifically Semitic. This is once again just false. It's human, not animal blood. This is something important that people in the pro-shroud team need to take into an account, that there is no guarantee that the blood on the shroud is human blood. Just because we see a human figure, human blood it does not make. And indeed, the science has been unable to distinguish whether or not the supposed blood, which is already semi-contested, is that of human or animal blood. That remains contested. There's male DNA or Y chromosome in the blood. This claim comes from the 1990s, and it's about sex marker sequence exists in secondary sources, but later work vacuuming dust from the cloth from mixed human mtDNA from many haplogroups, ergo heavy contaminants. So any male signal is inconclusive of the strains themselves, ergo this is contested, leaning false. UV shows serum separation halos around many stains, like transferred clotted blood. This is indeed observed, so this is technically a win. This is true. But there's a little bit of nuance to it. I'll put it in the true category because, again, that's technically true. But it's not definitive. There are other interpretations to that data that ought to be considered. UV fluorescence photography documented around halos around numerous red streams. Serum can fluoresce. An elevated bilirubin can enhance that, yet this remains an inferential, non-exclusive explanation. The unusual red color is due to high bilirubin from severe trauma. This is unproven, so contested, leaning false. The trauma bilirubin idea is long-standing. An applied optics study reviewed competing explanations and called the overall evidence debatable and not experimentally settled. The bloodstains formed before the body image, ergo, no body image under the blood. This is found in some of the original study groups that did some of the original, or were going to do. There's a bit of a dubious history with the carbon dating, as we'll get into. Independent confirmation of this is pretty limited. It's often asserted that the body image doesn't extend beneath the blood areas, implying sequence. The specific micromapping is cited repeatedly, but it hasn't been widely reproduced, with modern methods accessible to outside labs. So we could treat this as plausible, but not independently verifiable today, meaning I'm going to put it in the contested, leaning true category. Nanoparticles prove a torture victim's blood. This has been completely and utterly refuted. A 2017 PLOS 1 paper made this claim, and the journal subsequently retracted it in 2018 due to methodological reasons. This is going to be important, because this paper is actually from the same research group that subsequently did the new dating method. And if it isn't a giant red flag to you that their first paper got retracted, I don't know what to tell you. It's paint-pigment, not blood. That's a minority view. Like I said, most studies do seem to suggest that it's blood. We just don't know who or what blood. DNA on the shroud identifies individual or his origin. Once again, this is completely unproven. The best modern study in 2015 found a mix of worldwide human DNA and many plant taxa. So there's a lot of DNA on this stuff, some of it that ain't even human. So if you think you're going to find Yeshua's DNA on this, you're living in Disney World. I guess since everyone's going to be chomping at the bit over the dating section, we'll progress to there. So, I guess I'll start this section off by saying that I will not be engaging with anything that even remotely suggests that carbon dating is not reliable, because that's unscientific. With that being said, in today's world, the dating has become contested due to that recent news I just told you. So let's go over it. I'm waiting for my thing to update. I'm waiting. For those who don't know how the shroud was actually dated with carbon dating, to make an incredibly long and convoluted story very short, there was a group called STURP, or the Shroud of Turin Research Project. They initially proposed to the church a blind method of studying the shroud so that way they can have multiple independent sources test it. They went back and forth. Ultimately, that didn't happen. Well, I mean, there are two cuts made on the shroud is the gist. One on the top left and one on the bottom left. And those two cuts are the ones that were subsequently tested. This testing final protocol that they call it essentially had been directed by the British Museum, and it featured 3 laboratories. Oxford, Zurich, and Tuscan. So what were the actual results? Well, all three laboratories came up with a date range of 1260 to 1390 AD with a 95% confidence. The Nature report confirms that they were all taken from a single section, although interestingly enough, there is appears to be a second incision on the elsewhere. I guess I'll have to look into that when I record later sections. Now, to be clear, the carbon dating is slightly contested. There have been some quibbles in regards to the confidence level, in regards to the range, but no actual data or paper that suggests that it is wholly incorrect. And here's where we get to our first major shroud claims that are just not true. The first big one that I want to get into is that the fire that affected the shroud affected the carbon date. Now, this gets me a little frustrated because that's just not how carbon dating works. If you were to get carbon date that's freshly deposited from a fire, it would have dated to the fire, meaning that the carbon dates would have suggested a 1996 date, not a 1400s date. On top of this, an ORAU test showed that CO does not significantly react with the linen that the shroud is made of, meaning that even if we had extracted a piece of carbon from the fire, it would not have actually mattered since the piece of fabric itself is what was tested, and that does not chemically react with the fabric. So that's two reasons why the fire didn't affect it. Let's talk about the second claim made by this, which is that actually what they tested was a repaired piece from the Shroud of Turin. Now, one of the claims made by people who wish to contend with the carbon date is that in reality there was some sort of invisible repair that was made to the shroud. And I'm not making the invisible part up. The original paper posited by Sue Benford and Joseph G. Morano in 2000 directly call it in their paper an invisible weave. So why do they call it an invisible weave? Well, to make a long story short, the reason why they call it an invisible weave is that they don't have any proof that it's actually true. This particular claim actually got me so mad that I decided that I would even sit down and calculate the odds of this even being able to happen. You ready? You'll be able to see it. I'll put the equation up on a slide for you. If we were to allow for two different scenarios, one in which it is someone naive, unknowledgeable, whether or not it would be someone naive or unknowledgeable as to how to weave, which is the most likely scenario, you'd be looking at a rare weave class of 0.5% times the weave minority of 0.2 times the blind, which is 0.5, times the 1 out of 40, or 2.5%, DR, which is the counts happen to sit close. On a side note, it's creepy as hell being here alone. You know, I'm here in this facility weekly. I swear to God, I hear someone moving around. I swear to God. I swear to him. Okay? He's up here. He's here with me. There's someone else here. Wait a minute. I'm going to continue talking about the Shroud. Where was I? Oh, yes, the odds. Anyway, you can see up here that I have all the variables and whatnot, and you could read them for yourself. Ultimately, if we were to assume that the person is unskilled or naive, the odds of this happening are 0.0000125%. And if it's someone with skill, of which we can, enable a little more looseness to it, the odds are about 1.5%, give or take. Both of those, by the way, are generous numbers in favor of Shroud authenticity. They get significantly worse against Shroud authenticity. So, that is a piece of tinfoil going into the sandwich bag of truth. The only way this is even remotely possible is via a miracle. Now, not content enough to have disproven this statistically, Michthild Flury-Lemberg, the Swiss textile conservator, who actually is the expert who restored the Shroud of Turin in 2002, explicitly states that such a repair is, quote, impossible to do without leaving traces, and that no such traces exist on the Shroud. So, to be clear here, the people who claim it have no proof. The people who have actually worked with the Shroud claim that that's impossible. The statistics are miraculous at best and egregiously impossible at worst. This is a blatantly false claim. Additional to the fire claim is that there was also a 1532 fire that subsequently also affected the dating. The AMS pre-treatments methodologically remove such contaminants. And again, they don't really interact with the cloth. So it's the same thing there as it is. Any fire is not going to alter the date is the important part. A neuron radiation burst changed the Shroud's C14. Now, I'm going to get into the whole neuron burst laser stuff when I talk about the Shroud's image. I think it's a little more appropriate here. But I'm going to come on out and say it that this is just complete and utter nonsense. That's not how any of that works. There's no paper written that describes that process. There is no known process that can do that. And indeed, if there were substantial radioactive damage that could do that, we would probably have detected it. This is basically an ad hoc physics explanation that actually is so miraculous that it's going in the sandwich bag of miracles. So that's now 2 miracles that you're going to need in order to make the Shroud authentic. Non-radiocarbon methods date the fibers to the 1st century. Now, this is not in regards to the wax method. We'll get to the wax method. I want to talk about that by itself. There have been other claims like FTIR, Raymond, and mechanical proxies. All collaborate that it was aged to the 1st century. I looked high and I looked low. I could not find a single verifiable paper on this, which means it's false. There's no proof of this whatsoever. And finally, that the carbon dates are not reliable due to issues in the laboratory. Now, science actually admits that this could happen. We admit that pretty much explicitly in every paper whatsoever. But you would have to believe that this same systemic problem existed in all 3 labs in order for that to even work. So that's another miracle going into the sandwich bag. You know, I could buy maybe 1 or even 2 of them miraculously having one, but all 3 of them while consistently coming to the same date? No. That's a miracle right there. Now let's get on to this wax method. Spelled W-A-Q-S. Wait, no. No, that's a typo. What the heck? Spelled W-A-X-S. I'm keeping that mistake in just so that way people know I can make mistakes. What does it do? What does it mean? Well, it means wide angle X-ray scattering. Basically, what the wax method does is it looks as to how cellulose crystals inside flax fibers have degraded over centuries. X-rays produce a diffraction pattern with hallmark cellulose peaks. As linen ages, peak widths intensify, changes in ways that correlate with loss in crystallinity. Researchers build a calibration curve from reference textiles of known age that estimate an approx age from an unknown sample. The paper was done by the same guys who did that one retracted paper in 2017 for flawed methodology, which is why I'm bringing this back up for a reason. What they did to the Shroud of Turin is they actually looked at a thread that was pretty much near the radiocarbon corner. So I'm actually going to insert another miracle here. You want to know why? Because if you're going to quibble with the radiocarbon date on the idea that it's a repair piece, then you're going to have to believe that that repair piece just so happened to magically stop at that very edge that the wax method dated. We're now up to 4 miracles, boys and girls. There are just a litany of problems with this. For one, it assumes consistent storage conditions, of which, as I have pointed out at the beginning of this video when we're talking about the Shroud's history, is completely and utterly unproven. So that's one assumption. Another assumption is that the Shroud of Turin's current conditions are at all relatable to that of an older cloth based off said degradation. I have yet to see any proof that that's even remotely the case. Another big problem that I personally have, I haven't seen anyone mention this, is that cellulose crystals do not have consistent internal chemical structure. They're not minerals. They're cellulose. I can see this method doing very, very well for a mineral crystal where the internal chemical and structural integrity of said crystal is consistent, but because cellulose is a biological product, it lacks that consistency. That's not to say that there aren't biological products that aren't consistent. For instance, several invertebrate species such as snails and clams make shells out of calcite and aragonite that do have crystallographic consistency, but cellulose is not among them. So I would actually also go out to point out that the very material being tested is not applicable for this laser method. On top of this, if you actually bother to read the paper, you will note that this method failed to date several specimens. That's right. I'm not making this up. This new cutting-edge dating method failed to properly date several other samples in the test sample. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do need to ask something. How many samples do you think are required for a new dating method to be accepted? What's that? Hundreds of thousands. Well, that'd be correct. Hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. That can virtually guarantee that even if we have statistical outliers, a general trend would show, yeah? Would you trust any dating method that had 9 samples? Oh no, the sandwich bag of miracles. It's trying to run away because it knows what's about to happen. If you answered no, congratulations. You should consider getting an earth science degree. And if you said yes, no. The wax method only has 9 confirmed samples, and at the bare minimum 3 of those samples, if you do not include the shroud, which you bet I am, so that's 4, are not dated correctly. Oh yeah. If you want to believe the wax method is true, while it gets things blatantly false and is a misapplication of the technology, that's another miracle going in the sandwich bag. We're up to 5. We're up to 5 miracles. Honestly, I thought this bit was going to be a little more compelling. I thought I was going to make some more miracles. I could go back to the blood section and probably add a few more, but I'm feeling queasy about it, so that's not happening. So let's move on to talking about... Believe it or not, even the image on the shroud has problems. Ask yourself, dear viewer, how many heads tall are you? I ask because if you take a look at the proportions on the figure of the Shroud of Turin, and I will have something here that I will put post-editing, it becomes clear that this is not a real human. Now, there is a little bit of controversy on the height of the figure on the shroud. He's anywhere between 5 feet 7 inches, which is a little better in terms of height, but kind of worse in terms of proportions. All the way up to 6 feet 2 inches, which is absolutely massive for someone of first century Jewish origins. And don't worry, we're going to get to how the figure looks later in this section. But right now, let's just focus on proportions, because if you take a look at the figure, you will notice a problem. You can fit 2 other heads on his shoulder, and his entire body is what we would call idealized height, ergo not realistic. He's approximately about 1.25 heads his own height. Why is this a problem? Because the average human is about 7 heads, which means he's an entire head above regular height. But the Jewish, surely Yeshua could have been on average, yeah? Yeah, I suppose that's technically true, that Yeshua could have been above average. But considering the text tells us he wasn't much to look at, and that most certainly would have gone into the Gospels, don't bet on it, buddy. On top of that, we have a problem known as the Agamemnon mask effect. Now, what is the Agamemnon mask effect, and why is it important? The Agamemnon mask effect is essentially when you take any 3-dimensional object and try and flatten it into a flat surface, you will end up putting things on the side that are going to look awkward. Ergo, if there really was a linen wrapped on the face of anybody that then imparted their image, if you lay it flat, the sides ought to come out like this, which means that we should see the side of Yeshua's face on the shroud, and yet we don't. Oh yeah, that's going in the miracle pile. A number of people have insisted to me that the lack of an Agamemnon mask effect is part of the miracle. Why? Well, simple. Because it's part of that whole neutron blast thing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the neutron blast here and now. Again, I already made it clear that this is just not a true statement. In the sense that there's no physical evidence for it. You can believe that that is a miracle. But now I'm going to talk about the sandwich bag of miracles. Look, guys, I'm recording this at a synagogue. One of my first videos on this channel is talking about God's existence. I believe that there is a God, okay? I believe that supernatural things can happen. You want to know what I'm not going to believe? That this independent object has this many miracles, and believe me, there's more to be put inside this sandwich bag, all surrounding it, okay? The neutron blast is a presuppositional issue in that it only makes sense if you assume the miracle is true. And that's a problem because that is then using your assumptions to prove your assumptions. Ergo, the neutron blast in on itself cannot be used to prove that the shroud is a miracle. At least one of these things has to be proven in order for you to get me to accept the other one. On top of that, I'm hearing people talk about radiation incorrectly. Radiation shoots outward, not forward. That's why it's called radiation, because it radiates. That's important because that would double make sure that the Agamemnon mask effect would have happened on the Shroud of Turin, and we still don't see it. So either way you slice it, you either have to believe that the so-called radiation didn't create the Agamemnon effect, but still happened, or you have to believe that the radiation still occurred, really did shoot in all directions, but only hit one side of the laser, or only hit as if it were a laser. Put on top of that the fact that we know what the image on the shroud is made of. It's made of oxidized cellulose, and this entire talking point is completely out of line in terms of realism. It would require a complete and total breakdown of reality in order to make it work. And yes, I admit miracles can absolutely do that. But I'm only going to give you one, and we're up to 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sorry, I miscounted. We're up to 8 at this point. So if you want to pick that as your miracle, you're going to have to explain the other 7. This one's a big one. The cloth image behaves like a photo negative. This is established reality. This is true. It behaves like a photo negative. However, that's not all that big, actually. I know several people who think that the photo negative part of the shroud is some big mystery to it. And I'm going to explain later why it's not. I'm going to keep that for later in the video because it's part of my slam dunk for why this is not real. Just trust me on it. The photo negative bit is not that important and it doesn't really mean anything. We'll get to it later. The image intensity roughly tracks clothes to body distance. No. If you try and make a 3D image of this figure, you're going to see the proportional problem way worse. I'll have an image of a blender of the actual physical image made by a research group explicitly to demonstrate this. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, where people are intentionally shrinking his legs in order to make the proportions fit. I don't know what else to tell you other than it's misinformation. So that's controversial, leaning false. The image is extremely superficial, meaning that the color is limited to the outside of the thread. It doesn't permeate within the thread. That's true. What should be noted here is that that's a big problem for people who believe that the Shroud is legitimate. If you're one of these neutron blast guys, well, now you have to believe that the neutron blast didn't even go through the entirety of the Shroud. Which I can tell you one thing. That's got to be the single most miraculous thing to have happened, period, if that's true. Putting that in the bag of miracles. If anything, that proves that it's a painted or rubbed image. The body image is not simple heat scorch, ergo something from a, fire or temperature variant. That one's fairly obvious. That one's true. It's not from a heat scorch. There's no consensus on the pigment binders via no paint. Controversial. Heller and Adler reported blood chemistry and argued against paint. McCrone via microscopy and chemistry reported red, ochre, and vermilion in a binder. Both are in peer review venues, so this is a divided issue whether or not there's actual paint on this or not. Hidden images, some people claim to see coins, flowers, letters. I looked at the Shroud up and down. I don't see any letters. I don't see any coins. On top of that, if there were coins, flowers, or letters, that would almost certainly be hard proof that it's not real. For instance, coins. There's no first century Jewish tradition of putting coins on the eyes. He most certainly would not have been buried with flowers. And as for letters, why would whatever process made this, be it miraculous neutron blast or whatever, produce letters? Why would that be the case? Once again, that's a presuppositional argument that it's a miracle, and you first kind of need to prove that bit. The Shroud's image is what you would get if you were to lay it on a human being. This is probably going to be one of the more controversial takes, just like the wax method. No. I already talked about it earlier about the Agamemnon mask effect, but there's more to it than that. 3D renderings of the Shroud almost consistently demonstrate that the image that we get off the Shroud is more in line with a low-relief sculpture than a 3D human. That would be why we don't see the Agamemnon effect, and that would also be why the proportions are disproportionate, because it's a semi-3D image, not a full 3D image. Again, I'm going to get a little bit more into the rubbing part when I talk about a particular paper that was released in 2010, but the Shroud, the main takeaway here is that the Shroud does not portray a 3D image. It just doesn't. And very few tests, if any of them, have ever been able to even get close to showing that that is the case. There's one person who believes that it's a hoax, claiming that it's actually proto-photography. The guy who posted this paper is Nicholas Allen in the peer-reviewed In De Arte. I'm going to be frank here for the pro-hoax crowd. That's just straight-up nonsense. The idea that this is proto-photography, is just straight up nonsense. It faces chemical hurdles and has not been widely accepted for a good reason, because it's nonsense. Naturalistic body chemistry. A Maillard reaction from amines emitted by a body reacting with a thin impurity layer on linen. Chemically plausible, but unproven on full scale with observed constraints. So controversial, not leaning in either direction. There are people claiming that it was from a pure thermal scorch. I'm not going to bother to add a miracle to the bag over that. I mean, it's basically the same as the neuron blast. It just assumes that this is a miracle to begin with. Direct transfer from a full human corpse explains the whole image without projection effects. Again, it most certainly does not. Agamemnon mask effect.